This video was brought to you in part by the supporters of the AMTV Patreon. Thank you. Hello, and welcome to this year's run of Christmas specials on the Ident Review Extra, the show where we take a look at one individual ident each episode and give it the review it deserves. And this time, we're taking a look at the festive sequences that represented BBC1 in the 1990s. Grab that warm brew as we begin in 1990. Ever since they first began using Christmas-themed idents in the late 1960s, the BBC quickly developed a certain style for its festive offerings. Through the 70s and 80s, the Christmas sequences became ever more colourful, elaborate, and arguably more memorable with each passing year. Which brings us to the year 1990. The 90s had begun, and it was time for the corporation to start showing the public how it was going to present itself for this new decade. The main change in appearance wouldn't occur until 1991, but for Christmas, as usual, a unique ident was crafted to air throughout the festive weeks. So let's now take a look at what they came up with.
Christmas on BBC1.
It's time to pull our special Christmas Day comedy cracker. 2 hours of classic entertainment with the two Ronnies, Dad's Army, and a great moment in comic history, the first ever episode of Hello Hello.
Who doesn't love a good bit of magic at Christmas? We see a wizard whiz around the space, seeing a shelf full of animated items, casting magic about the place, and eventually piecing together the BBC1 logo with the Christmas moniker. The main placeholder ident that appears is a wonderful blend of what was the central BBC1 ident at the time and the Christmas theme of magic and wonder. If you look closely at the spinning globe, you'll notice the same blue and gold globe that is the computer-originated world. The remainder of the picture is a blend of blue and gold, keeping with the main channel branding. Nice little bit of continuity. The face on the globe, or moon or whatever it is, reminds me a lot of the classic 1902 film A Trip to the Moon, crafted by film visionary Georges Méliès. It may not have been an intentional inclusion, but it looks ace nonetheless. The BBC1 logo itself looks similar enough to its regular appearance, now appearing a bit jumbled, giving us a sense of relaxing, letting go a little bit, and changing things up for the festive period. The way the word Christmas has been stylised also looks excellent. All in all, when you put all of these little clips together, you have quite a wondrous ident for Christmas. I love the idea of magic playing a part, the abstract use of the globe and BBC1 logo, and to top it off, the music that goes with it is absolutely top-notch. It feels fun and fresh, sprightly and bouncy, just the right kind of vibes that you want for Christmas. The 1990 Christmas ident for BBC1 does a great job of maintaining the corporation's stellar reputation for festive sequences, and as the decade progresses on, we'll have to see whether they can keep this creative streak up, or if they start to rest on their laurels. "1991 proved to be a major year for the BBC in terms of its visual presentation. In February, both BBC1 and BBC2 changed their main idents, introducing some of the most iconic sequences in TV ident history. BBC2 began its onslaught of quirky yet engaging 2 idents, for which we've previously marathoned here on the Ident Review Extra, and BBC1 swapped out the computer-originated world for the virtual globe, continuing the spherical motif the BBC had been using since the 60s, but updating it to present a more classy, stylish, and sophisticated look. For Christmas of 1991, it would be the first chance the BBC would have to adapt the new look for the festive season. So let's see what they came up with for the Christmas of 1991.
A very good morning to you and welcome to our programmes on BBC1. But just before we start, on behalf of everyone at BBC Television, we'd like to wish you a very happy Christmas. So now we begin by unwrapping a bumper package of programmes for our younger viewers.
The 90s certainly had a way of making you feel cosy. This sequence is far less animated than what we saw in 1990, but I'd argue that's not necessarily a bad thing. The virtual globe setting has been adapted, now set against a starry sky, the instantly recognisable 1 numeral set against a gorgeously tinted moon. Funny how twice in a row now we've had the theme of the moon going on. Maybe the designers really did like George Méliès. We also see an animation of Santa and his reindeers swirling around the moon, shooting off into the night to presumably deliver presents to people the world over. As the continuity announcer speaks, various stars in the background glint, and the mist effect around the moon is subtle, but a really nice touch. If I could critique anything, I would have loved the corporate BBC logo, which is seen at the bottom, to have been adapted with a bit of Christmas flair, even if it was just a change of colours. The music works well, but feels more like a short sting rather than a proper track. But aside from these nitpicks, BBC One, in my opinion, scored another winner that Christmas in terms of its idents. Before we go, I wanted to show you a special variant of this sequence that was shown on Christmas Day itself to celebrate the network premiere of A Certain Dark Night.
Now on One, we're about to enter the twilight zone of Gotham City. We present the first network television appearance of Jack Nicholson as the Joker and Michael Keaton as Batman.
Absolutely love this. There ain't a great deal to it, just the one fading away so that the bat signal can take its place, but it's such an iconic nod to the Batman series that you can't help but love it. It's great that the BBC found the premiere of the 1989 Batman film to be such a big deal that they go to the effort to slightly alter their ident for this one occasion. They sometimes do this with idents today, but I wish it was more of a regular occurrence for event television. If 1991 was a year of change for the BBC's visual presentation, then I think it's fair to say they kicked things off with a bang. The beautiful black, blue and purple colours, the standout image of the moon providing the background to the one numeral, the little touch of animation, it all works a treat. That sense of excitement, the cosy feeling of looking up at the moon on a Christmas night in the hopes of seeing Santa, that's just the kind of vibe you'd want all throughout December. That's 2 winners in a row, but could they make it a hat-trick the following year? After major visual changes to its presentation in 1991, the BBC had somewhat found its footing in the 90s, by the time the following year was drawing to a close. It had long-running programmes maintaining their success such as EastEnders and Casualty, and new programmes were being shown to millions of viewers eagerly tuning in. For Christmas time, the BBC once again introduced special festive idents for both BBC One and BBC Two. The younger channel went for a Christmas tree motif, with the colours of the season, red and green, being hard to miss. So for BBC One, it seems we panned the camera down to what's under the tree. Now, let's have a look and see what we've got this year.
Meanwhile, I think I'll just sit back and let you introduce the next programme.
Bit of a mixed bag this one. On the surface, I really like what we see. The idea of the one numeral being amongst a plethora of Christmas presents is a really fun idea. Amongst the gifts we can see a crocodile, a snowman, various toys, and even a Christmas pud. A streak of light hits the one, which begins to shine like the star that ironically is normally found on top of the tree. We get some quick reactions from the crocodile, and the snowman continues to bob up and down in levitation, which, if I'm honest, feels a little unnerving after a while. Having the one as a sort of shining star is a great concept, but beyond everything I've just mentioned, there isn't a huge amount more to look at. With all of the toys and gifts dotted around, I think there could have been a great opportunity to animate more of them, give the whole sequence a lot more life and movement. Don't get me wrong, this is far from the worst ident I've ever seen, but after what we saw from BBC One after 1990 and 1991, this I would argue serves as a bit of a letdown. The Christmas of 1992 is a case of two halves. On one hand, the ident presented here is a lovely homage to some of the joys of Christmas, finding presents under the tree, some of them coming to life, all in a raft of gorgeous red, green and gold colours. So from a purely visual appeal standpoint, this ident is a success. However, the lack of animation, the lack of anything else really happening, for me at least, as a viewer, leaves me wanting a lot more. But it still feels like Christmas, and in my opinion, at the very least, that's what a Christmas ident should set out to achieve. With 1993 around the corner, could BBC One bring it back to a creative high for Christmas? What a special year 1993 was. Why, you ask? Well, for one, it gave us the greatest piece of Doctor Who ever in the charity special Dimensions in Time, which of course is canon. At Christmas time, things were equally unique. The number one that year was Mr. Blobby with, well, Mr. Blobby. But over on BBC One, it was once again time to debut a brand new Christmas-themed ident to take audiences through their December programming. So far this decade, we've had themes of magic, the moon, and presents under the tree. I wonder which theme will be treated to this time. Let's find out as we take a look at the BBC One ident for for Christmas of 1993.
A movie premiere for Christmas night now on BBC One, starring Patrick Swayze, Demi Moore and Whoopi Goldberg in Oscar-winning form. Ghost.
Talk about icy blue cool. On first impressions, colour-wise this feels very similar to the ident we saw back in 1991, which incorporated a swath of blues and purples into the dark night sky. This one is more ground-based, with predominantly blue and white shades helping to create a snow-covered landscape, in which the numeral 1 sits centre screen. At first I thought the number was a sort of snowman type design, however upon closer inspection it looks more like an ice sculpture, an elegant symbol standing alone amongst the snow. I think this ident also benefits from background detail. If you look close enough, you can see the shimmers of light dancing about, almost like it's alluding to the Aurora Borealis, or as it's more commonly known, the Northern Lights. It's a small detail, but one that definitely contributes to the overall sequence. It may all look a little dated now, some of the elements look very blocky, but we have to remember this was made almost 30 years ago. The music soundtrack perfectly complements the sequence too, nice and calm, easily capturing the warmth and coziness of Christmas. All in all, another smash hit for the BBC's flagship channel. 1993 was a year for change amongst many aspects of pop culture, and BBC One embraced that change once again for Christmas. After 1992's effort felt a little lackluster in some areas, the 1993 variant again employs a very simple concept, but pulls it off to a much higher degree arguably. Whether it's the cool tones of colour, the elegant central ice structure, the calming music, all of the elements come together naturally and successfully to create one of the most endearing Christmas idents of the 1990s. I would say the 1991 sequence is still my favourite of the decade so far, but 93 pulls in at a close second. Will 1994 come in and blow it all out of the water? As the world approached the midpoint of the 1990s, the BBC across its two main channels were holding steadfast in their visual appearance. BBC Two continued to receive new variants of its iconic 2 numeral, whereas BBC One maintained the old standard of having just one central ident represent the channel, the virtual globe presenting a stylish and sophisticated appearance. However, Christmas time would always change that, with the flagship channel receiving a brand new festive offering every year to represent itself. So let's sit back and have a look at what audiences were presented with in 1994.
Beware of suspicious-looking penguins before that on BBC One, as Wallace and Gromit star in the Oscar-winning animated tale of The Wrong Trousers.
I'm seeing a returning pattern emerge here. This wasn't the first time in which the theming of Christmas presents was used by BBC One in the 90s. Back in 1992, we saw the famous numeral shine as one of the presents underneath the colourful Christmas tree. It was a bit hit or miss, but still felt festive. This time around, we have 2 snowmen unravel the one numeral, which then shines in a bright yellow as a prime object on the mantelpiece. The stop motion animation is so charming. It's a very tricky art form in itself, but when you see it in action, the detail of the craft comes through, and this ident is no exception. The notion of the one being unwrapped almost feels like an evolution of the sequence we saw back in 1992, and the shining yellow tones, in my opinion, work far better than white. The musical score is a little less impressive, however. Compared to the previous 90s offerings we've looked at, this one so far is arguably the most forgettable. Just a cacophony of jingle bells and some odd notes here or there to mark the unwrapping. It works considering the sequence is so short, but a fuller sounding sequence, I think, could have added to the impact of this even more. In fact, just as a nitpick, I wish this ident had been longer on the whole. Perhaps with a moving camera, surveying the room and just what's in it before the one's revealed. I can only hope that as we continue through the 90s, that the Christmas idents for BBC One progressively get a bit more advanced to correlate with the movement of technology. To class BBC One's 1994 Christmas ident as a success is of course subjective, as it is with all sequences. In my view, this hasn't yet topped the 91 variant for my favourite festive offering for the channel, but it works with its charming animation and lovely unwrapping concept. So far in this series, we haven't come across a sequence that I would class as an outright dud, but we still have another few years to go, and surely they can't succeed every time, right? Another year, another festive ident for BBC One. The channel once again continued to use the virtual globe as its main sequence, as it had been since 1991. However, in the technological world, things were advancing all the time. For the virtual globe's debut, the Super Nintendo was just coming out. Now, 4 years later, the Sony PlayStation was hitting the scene. In the world of TV, programmes were getting ever more ambitious, particularly with the use of computer-generated effects. So for the Christmas of 1995, BBC One would once again experiment with the use of CG. Let's see what they came up with as audiences tuned in during December.
A family movie for Christmas Day now on BBC One. Robin Williams is a grown-up 1990s Peter Pan, rediscovering Neverland and crossing swords with Dustin Hoffman, the evil Captain Hook.
Ah, the Christmas star, an old favourite. To have the one numeral be the star atop of a Christmas tree seems like a really obvious concept. The fact it took them this long to implement it is quite surprising. We see a CG plane fly by, transforming the traditional star into the famous numeral. Now to my eyes, the plane looks computer generated, though the quality of the footage is old and I don't have the best eyesight, so it could very well be a clever piece of stop motion animation. But it looks very blocky and polygonal, so I'll take my claims and say it's a bit of CG work. Whether it is or not, the plane looks very slick for the time, though the focus quickly shifts to the one shimmering atop of the tree. Fair to say, it does look great. The constant outbursts of light help keep the focus at the top, and the plane flying about just adds that little bit of extra detail. My main criticism here would be the background. The red looks nice, but I wish they'd filled it out a little more. It could have had more decorations, some more variations of the one numeral. I honestly think there could have been a way to do this without making the overall sequence feel too cluttered or stuffed with objects. Alternatively, a gradual zoom in could have worked. Say you start seeing the tree in full, before zooming closer to the top where we see the one shining. It's all what ifs of course, but I just think it could have made this one a lot more interesting. As it stands, another static shock sequence, it does work, but is it the best of the decade? In my opinion, far from it. The 1995 Christmas ident for BBC One does have its positive qualities, but you could also argue that it's a turning point. A point where the corporation were perhaps starting to grow a bit complacent in how they presented their festive offerings on the main channel. I mean, if you compare some of BBC One's festive sequences to what was going on BBC Two, it's like chalk and cheese. Static shock sequences can and do work, but for BBC One, I would say by the middle of the 90s, it was seriously time for a switch up in how their Christmas idents were presented. I've got to tell you right off the bat, folks, that 1996 was truly quite the incredible year. Did it have anything to do with my birth? Absolutely not, but it's just a year that retains a lot of affection for many. Over at the BBC, the corporation was preparing to undergo the most major shake-up in terms of its brand identity in several decades, but it wouldn't be until the following year before that overhaul would be seen by audiences. The virtual globe still spun daily for BBC One, but as Christmas approached, it was time once again for the designers to deliver a unique festive sequence to represent the channel through December. We've seen success in this decade so far, and not so much abject failures, but some idents that don't necessarily fire on all cylinders. So let's see what was showcased for 1996, the last Christmas ident to feature the slanted BBC corporate logo.
Unlikely heroes for BBC One now in the video game turned action movie, tackling scary evil forces, the plumbers extraordinaire, Super Mario Brothers.
I can see we've once again gone with elegance. The central motif this time around is a sort of chocolate box, which once the lid is removed by these small characters, reveals the numeral 1 within a casing of purple cushioning. The mixture of gold and purple looks absolutely stunning, and the red tones of the box further complementing the whole aesthetic. In terms of colour combinations, this is now probably my favourite mixture for BBC One throughout the decade thus far. However, despite the beautiful elegance of the colours and the central motif, I do find myself disappointed in other aspects with this one. Namely that once again, this ident is comprised of a locked camera shot. Not a bad thing in itself, I mean several BBC One Christmas idents have worked despite being a static scene, but by 1996, so many other channels were really beginning to play around with more story-based festive sequences, as well as using different angles and computer techniques to help stand them out from the crowd. And whilst BBC One's offering for the year looks lovely and is very stylistically simplistic, it doesn't exactly offer you too much to keep you watching, bar some minimal movements from the two characters that surround the box. The music this time around also leaves a lot to be desired. I'm all for short little sounds and jingles, but I miss the use of a really full sound, one which cements the ident's feel and vibe, rather than just provide some background sound effects. Overall, I like many things about the 96 Christmas ident for BBC One, but as we race towards the end of the 90s, that feeling of complacency in the design approach begins to ring a lot louder for me. 1996 may not have been everyone's personal favourite year, but I'd argue in terms of Christmas idents, for BBC One, this serves as one of the last sequences designed for the festive period, presented in a traditional style. a static shot, the corporate logo always visible, whilst presenting an adapted version of its more common variant, swathed in elegance and style, with gorgeous colours and an overriding connection to the festive period. It may feel less aligned with Christmas compared to many of the previous efforts we've seen, but for me at least, it does send across an inviting and warm vibe that makes me want to tune in to see the festive offerings from BBC One. But next year would be an immense year for change, not just for BBC One, but for the entire corporation. "1997 was a big year for the BBC. It underwent a corporate rebrand, which debuted towards the end of the year, but it wasn't just the BBC logo that was different, but it also swapped out the virtual globe for something a lot more real. The new BBC1 Idents comprised of a singular balloon with the world printed upon it. The balloon would be seen flying above different parts of the UK and would mark the beginning of a new era for the channel. However, some traditions did carry over, one of them being the need for a new Christmas ident to represent the main channel come December time. Not to stick to just one sequence, 1997 would see BBC One have not one, two, or even three variants, but four. Four idents that utilised a festive classic.
And movie time starts now on BBC One. Comedy with a juvenile hellraiser at the orphanage, Problem Child.
A fantasy adventure in a magical kingdom now on BBC One, a never-ending story.
Blue Peter in a moment on BBC One. First, here's Peter Cockcroft with a weather warning. And now BBC One Christmas Eve news in the southeast.
Shame they didn't go all the way. Granted, having 12 variants of an ident for Christmas may seem a bit too extreme, but to have a third of the song covered is a feat nonetheless. Of course, this year BBC One is using the 12 Days of Christmas as its main source of inspiration. Everything is kept relatively simple, with visual representations for each line, most of which look exactly how you'd imagine them, though I have to say, the 8 Maids a Milking variant is bizarre. So this person is apparently a maid with a bucket of milk on her head? I get that maybe showing someone milking may have been a bit weird to begin with, but why go with this? It seems very abstract and weird, in that very special late 90s way. The others seem more conventional, some having fun twists. The 10 Lords leaping via space hoppers, which is still a firm favourite toy to this day. The partridge looks really nice design-wise, as does the pear tree, a very homemade arts and crafts kind of feel. For the 5 gold rings, there only seems to be 2 of them, which again seems a tad bizarre, and I don't really see why they couldn't have thrown the 3 missing rings into the sequence. Still, all 4 variants have a charm with the children's choir that accompany them, and to be honest, can you really go wrong with the 12 Days of Christmas? Well, you can, if you find that it drags. Maybe it's best that they didn't do all 12, eh? All in all, the first Christmas for the revamped BBC One goes some ways to deviate from what came before in the 1990s, whilst retaining some elements. Camera-wise, we're still on one static shot, but given the variety and the varied movement that we see, it doesn't really come across as much of a detriment here than it did for some of the previous sequences. I like that they decided to adapt a classic and push the boat out a little bit, at least for what was standard back in 1997. The 90s are gradually nearing the end, and the BBC was still settling in with its new visual identity after the corporate rebrand of 1997. We saw that the first Christmas under the new design broke new ground whilst also keeping some elements of the past. So with 1998, you think that they'd want to push the boat out even further in terms of design and concept, right? Well, once again, we have multiple variants this year, 3 to be exact. Without further ado, let's see what audiences were given on BBC One for the Christmas of 1998.
Leslie Garrett and Charlotte Church are just 2 of the superstar singers on BBC One now in a fabulous festive musical set.
A prankster returns to Metropolis with a flashy device that halts people in their tracks. Superman at 11:55. First on BBC One, film comedy is All I Want for Christmas.
And before that on BBC One, just in case you'd like some ideas for your brand new power drill or paintbrushes.
Really? That's it? Don't get me wrong, as I've said before, static shock idents can and do work, particularly Christmas ones. But after all the variety we saw in 1997, after the gorgeous colour combinations we saw earlier in the decade, we've dropped to this? White and red are of course the colours of Christmas too, but for the only prominent colour being the red bauble in the centre, everything else looks so vast and, well, empty. It's not even like you can see a classic globe design on the bauble, it is literally just a bauble. The snow effect comes across more as an irritant than as a useful bit of the sequence, and even the other variations, featuring a reindeer and some penguins, feel so lacklustre. They just mosey about the screen, not really doing much of anything, and that's about it. Slate the 1997 Christmas Idents all you want, but at least the things in them were actually doing something for the most part. The music I like, very Christmassy and soft to the ears, but it doesn't exactly have much to compliment. I'm sure they may enjoy these 1998 variants for their simplicity, but for me, these are all truly major misfires. Like most BBC Christmas idents throughout the decades, I'm sure the 1998 variants have their fans who either grew up with them or appreciate them in some way. But for me, the absolute bare-bones approach, right down to the use of a simple bauble, is just disappointing. It comes across like an afterthought, like a last-minute decision, and any good ident needs a good deal of thought and detail put into its design and concept to make it work efficiently. It may spark the imagery of Christmas, but the festive season of 1998 was far from being a winner for BBC One, at least in the visual department. "1999, God, it sounded so exciting back in the day, didn't it? The last year of the 20th century, the final 12 months before the dawn of the new millennium, before the impressive sounding 2000 would begin. Lots of major pop culture moments happened in 1999, but for the BBC, they continued to embrace their new visual image and also uphold the tradition of a new Christmas ident every year. Since the rebrand in 1997, we've seen some change, some good, some bad, really bad 1998 looking straight and squarely at you, but for the final year of the 20th century, BBC One had one final chance to really make a serious impression for the festive season, to give audiences an ident that they wouldn't forget in a hurry. Did they succeed? Let's find out.
BBC One's season of Michael Caine films continues now with plans for a new business venture and some great ways to avoid a traffic jam. The Italian Job.
Stunning. Absolutely stunning. After the bland and boring 1998 Christmas ident, this one completely blows it out of the water. We're treated to a lovely starry sky, in which the BBC One balloon is hovering before the image of Santa himself is revealed in a very Northern Lights kind of manner. First of all, fantastic idea to include the BBC balloon in this sequence. Considering the balloon was the main BBC One ident that played on tellies all year round, to adapt it for Christmas seems like an absolute no-brainer, and I'm surprised it took them this long to do it. The red and yellow colours of the balloon work magically well with the blue and black starry sky, and the red and white of Santa just blends even better. I love how they went with a Northern Lights style look for this image, how he emerges and the way it's animated. It looks gorgeous, and really makes you feel like Christmas time is well and truly here. You have the warm, cozy feeling of the night sky, the brightness of the balloon, and the familiar icon of Santa all in one. It's Christmas done to a T. The music is lovely too, how it builds with Santa appearing, and how its presence remains constant, but not too overbearing or too subtle. The 1999 Christmas ident for BBC One not only continues the idea of pushing visual boundaries, but absolutely eclipses the efforts seen the previous year. Rather than go for bare bones, nothing has been spared here. They've gone all out. It could have been cool if the camera had moved about a bit more, but considering all of the positive elements this sequence has, I'm not going to complain too much. Iconic and Christmassy. It doesn't get much better than that. All in all, the 1999 Christmas ident for BBC One was a perfect way for the channel to close out not just the decade, but the entire 20th century. You have the cementation of the new visual design, with the inclusion of the balloon, which itself harkens back to the glory days of the globe motif, which was used for decades. You have the iconography of Santa, which of course remains timeless to this very day, and the dark and starry night itself evokes a sense of comfort, familiarity, and of peace. As the world was tumbling towards a brand new millennium, viewers of BBC One could rest easy that the channel they had grown up with for so long was here to stay, ready to embrace change, whilst also remembering to celebrate Christmas in style. And believe it or not, we've reached the end of our journey. We started in 1990, a brand new decade, one in which the BBC was able to make magic and capture Christmas vibes in their own unique way. We've seen them change and adapt their style, utilising the key parts of the festive season whilst retaining their own iconography in the mix. We've witnessed the huge corporate rebrand, the positives and negatives that change brought to Christmas on BBC One, and we've just closed off the decade with arguably one of the best BBC One Christmas idents that's ever graced the television screen. It may not have been a decade of winners every year, but it was a decade of experimentation, and really, If we don't experiment, push the boundaries, or try new things, we can't ever hope to evolve. And in terms of their Christmas-themed idents, BBC One certainly managed to evolve, all whilst keeping the festive frivolities and fun that we come to associate with Christmas. And so that brings us to the end of another marathon here on the Ident Review Extra. If you enjoyed this throwback to the Christmas seasons of the 1990s, then please leave a like, comment your thoughts below, and subscribe to the channel for lots more ident-related content. I've been Martyn from AMTV. Thank you for watching. I hope you had a very Merry Christmas and have a Happy New Year. Well, that does bring us to the end of another day here on AMTV. We do hope you enjoyed the programme, and a special thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, and to everyone who's tuned in. Until the next broadcast, we wish you a good night.